The river is quiet this morning, but the town looks like it already knows what's coming. A thin fog sits low over the Merrimack, flattening the distance. Bare winter branches scrape at a pale sky. A row of small houses sits behind trees that have forgotten their leaves. The streets are narrow and soft-shouldered, and the road dust has a dark, damp look, like something has been pressed into it and sealed there. Near the low ground, flood marks cling to old fence posts. A stop sign leans slightly, the kind of lean you only notice when everything else is still. In the distance, a bridge hums with passing traffic, steady and indifferent. Times Beach was never meant to be famous. It was meant to be affordable, easy, a place you could live without asking permission. And then a simple promise became a sentence: keep the dust down. What happens when a town is erased because of poison, because of water, or because of fear?
Chapter 1. A resort town on borrowed ground.
The first thing to understand is that Times Beach was always living on the river's permission. Times Beach began as a small, practical dream, not a grand one, not a postcard town, just a place close enough to St. Louis to reach on a weekend, far enough to feel like an escape. In its early identity, it carried the mood of a resort town in miniature. Cabins, small homes, summer routines that revolved around the river and the heat, and the slow relief of getting out of the city. People came for fishing, floating, cookouts, the sound of insects in the evening, and the kind of quiet that makes a radio in the next house feel like company. But rivers are not decorations. They are systems. They rise, fall, and return to old habits. A floodplain is a bargain. The land is cheaper because the land has conditions. And Times Beach, for all its ordinariness, was shaped by one central fact. Much of it sat low along the Merrimack River in a place where flooding was not a remote possibility, but an old pattern the landscape remembered. That matters because it changes how a community lives even when the river is calm. People learn to watch the weather. They learn which parts of town hold water first. They learn the strange, small rituals of flood living, what to lift, what to seal, what can be sacrificed, what can't. They learn that some things are not permanent in the way you want them to be permanent. And still, they build a life. That's the part that often gets lost when a place becomes a headline. We remember the ending, but we forget the years when everything felt normal enough to plan for next summer. Times Beach was small, roughly a square mile by later official descriptions, and close enough to a major metro that it wasn't isolated in the wilderness sense. It wasn't a mythic frontier town, it was a real community with ordinary needs. That ordinary needs detail matters because it explains why the town made decisions that sound strange to us now looking backward with the benefit of hindsight. When your roads are mostly dirt and gravel, and you don't have the tax base to pave everything, you solve problems the way small towns solve problems. You take what's available. You accept what seems reasonable. You trust the people who show up with practical answers. This is not foolishness. It's survival inside a budget. So yes, the river shaped Times Beach, but it didn't shape it into a tragedy on its own. For decades, the town existed inside that floodplain bargain, taking the good seasons and enduring the bad ones. It's important to hold that in your mind, because later, when people say Times Beach as shorthand for contamination and evacuation, it can start to sound like the town was always doomed. It wasn't. It was a small town doing what small towns do, making do, keeping life moving, trying to enjoy the parts that were enjoyable. Listen to the wind. The river is not loud today. It's only present as a pressure in the air, the way water is always, even when you can't see it from your street. And now we come to the problem that sounds harmless until it isn't. Chapter 2. Dust on the roads, oil in the air. When a town can't afford a pavement, it starts accepting solutions it never gets to fully inspect. If you've lived on dirt or gravel roads, you know the dust isn't just a nuisance, it's a kind of constant negotiation with your own home. In dry weather, dust climbs into the air with every passing car. It coats windowsills, it settles into porch furniture, it gets tracked into kitchens, it makes laundry into a chore you can't win. It makes you feel like you're always cleaning and never finishing. And dust has a social dimension too. It changes how a place looks. It can make a neighborhood feel poorer than it is. It can make simple living look like neglect, even when it's just the reality of unpaved roads. So towns look for fixes. In the era when Times Beach was trying to keep itself livable on limited resources, one fix sounded straightforward: use oil to suppress the dust. The idea was simple: spray a binding layer on the road surface, and the dust stays down. The road feels calmer. The air feels cleaner. According to EPA summaries, Times Beach used waste oil for dust control on its unpaved roads in the early 1970s. That sentence is easy to read quickly, like it's a footnote, but it's the hinge point. Because it shows how a disaster can start without drama. It starts as a bargain. A cheap, practical solution arrives at exactly the moment you're tired of coughing and wiping everything you own. And the town accepts. The road darkens after the spray. The gravel binds together. The air feels better. It looks for a moment like improvement. The story remains quiet. No alarms, no sirens, no immediate obvious consequence. This is one of the most unsettling patterns in these kinds of stories, and it's why they work so well for a lean-back documentary audience. The danger doesn't arrive with a monster. It arrives with a service, and services have invoices, not jump scares. Pause. This is also the moment where an older audience tends to lean in because the logic is familiar. Many people grew up around practices that were considered normal at the time and later reclassified as risky: lead paint, asbestos, certain pesticides. The world changes its mind as knowledge builds. So when you tell this part calmly, without moralizing, you invite the viewer into reflection instead of forcing them into judgment. Nobody in Times Beach was trying to invite disaster. They were trying to settle dust. And now, into that very ordinary problem enters a very ordinary character: a man with a truck, a contractor doing a job, a name you would not remember if everything had stayed normal. Chapter 3. The hauler with a side business. A contractor arrives with a spray truck and a promise, and nobody thinks to ask what the promise is made of. His name was Russell Bliss. To residents, he was the person who sprayed the roads, the person doing the work, the person solving the dust problem. Not a villain, not a celebrity, not a character in the town's story, just a contractor. But later, when investigators traced what had happened, the EPA's own historical summary tied the road spraying to contaminated waste oil associated with Bliss's hauling operation. This is where the story changes texture, because now we're no longer talking about dust control as a general practice. We're talking about what was in the oil. And the name that enters the story next is one that doesn't belong in a neighborhood: dioxin. The word itself sounds like something that should come with a warning label, something from a lab, not a street. In public summaries and later reporting, the Times Beach crisis became linked to dioxin contamination, specifically the presence of a highly toxic form that raised serious concern among health officials and regulators. Now, the important thing for our tone is this: we don't turn dioxin into a cartoon villain. We don't shout. We tell the viewer what matters. It's invisible, persistent, and complicated. And because it's complicated, it created space for fear, space for argument, space for folklore. Because the human mind hates an invisible threat, it wants something it can point to, something it can avoid with a simple rule. Don't go near that building, don't drive down that road. But what do you do when the concern is the ground itself? Soils, dust, the stuff that sticks to shoes and dog paws, the stuff that children touch without thinking, the stuff that gets tracked onto floors. So the questions begin, even before the headlines. Is it dangerous for everyone, or only in certain spots? Is it dangerous only if you ingest it, or also if you breathe it? Is it dangerous now, or dangerous over decades? If you garden, does it matter more? If you don't garden, does it matter less? And because science often answers these questions with probabilities and caveats, the town enters a new emotional landscape: uncertainty. This is where we begin the dual intent design naturally, because in Times Beach, two stories exist at once. The eerie story is the one people repeat because it's clean: a town was poisoned and erased. The grounded story is the one that takes longer to tell. Contamination concerns grew, investigations advanced, and officials faced the additional reality that this town sat on a floodplain where future floods could move soils and spread risk in ways that were hard to control. And that floodplain detail, quiet at first, becomes the reason the story turns irreversible. But we're not there yet. Right now, the town is still living in the time before certainty, before the national spotlight, before the winter flood that changes the conversation. So stay here for a moment. Picture the roads after spraying: darker, slightly glossy in places when the light hits right. Picture a child riding a bike through a dusty afternoon, happier because the dust cloud is smaller than it used to be. Picture a dog cutting across a yard, paws tapping the ground, then returning to a porch. All of it normal, all of it ordinary, and underneath, the unseen residue doing what it does best: staying quiet. Pause. In a moment, we're going to reach the turning point that forces the entire town into a decision it cannot negotiate with. Not a chemical revelation alone: water. Because once floodwater enters the story at the same time as contamination, the problem stops being local and becomes uncontrollable. And that is when a town stops being a town and becomes a case file.
Chapter 4: Where the Poison Came From. This is the part where an ordinary dust control job quietly connects to an industrial chain that never expected to meet a small river town. Dioxin is the kind of word that makes people sit up straighter even if they cannot define it. It sounds permanent. It sounds like something that doesn't belong in a neighborhood. And in a sense, that instinct is correct. What matters for our story is not chemistry trivia. What matters is the pathway: how something made in one world can end up in another without anyone meaning to carry it there. The EPA's own retrospective timeline describes an early 1970s moment that reads like the beginning of a slow-motion disaster. A waste oil hauler, Russell Bliss, was hired to remove a highly contaminated residue, and then that contamination was mixed into waste oil and used for dust suppression at more than 20 dozen locations in Missouri, including Times Beach. Read that again, slowly. Not a single location, more than 20 dozen. And not a spill that happened in public. A mixture that traveled intentionally as a service. This is the first uneasy truth in the Times Beach story. The problem did not arrive as a sudden accident. It arrived as a familiar transaction disguised as usefulness. In small towns, a contractor spraying roads can look like a small form of progress. In official terms, it's dust suppression. In human terms, it's relief. You can open your windows. You can hang laundry without feeling like you are painting your shirts with gravel dust. You can breathe. So when this practice begins, it doesn't feel like a crisis beginning. It feels like life getting a little easier. But there's a second uneasy truth. Dioxin is not the kind of concern that announces itself. It doesn't have a smell you can trust. It doesn't always cause immediate symptoms that point directly back to a single cause. It sits in soil. It clings to dust. It waits for time and attention to do their work. And this is where the story becomes emotionally complicated for the viewer, especially an older audience. Because many people grew up in a world where industrial byproducts were handled with a casualness that now seems almost unbelievable. People did not always know, and when they knew a little, they often assumed someone else knew more. Times Beach sits inside that era, a place of weekend cabins and working families attached by invisible threads to manufacturing and disposal systems that ran on the far side of public understanding. The EPA's timeline makes another point that tends to trigger the comment section when we tell it calmly. Bliss was not spraying only Times Beach. The same mixture was used on horse arenas and other sites around Missouri. That means Times Beach was not picked, it was included. That distinction matters because it shifts the emotional lens from evil targeting to systemic spillover. It forces the viewer to ask a quieter, more disturbing question. How many ordinary places have the similar invisible history beneath them? Pause. Listen to the wind. Now, before Times Beach becomes the name that everyone remembers, there are warning signs that appear elsewhere first. Not always in humans, often in animals, often in places where the story is still small enough to be dismissed. And that's where the next chapter lives.
Chapter 5. Warning Signs Nobody Wanted to Read. Before the town ever made national news, the state already had whispers, and some of those whispers came from barns. The first warnings in a story like this rarely arrive with official letterhead. They arrive as rumors, as odd coincidences, as stories that sound too strange to repeat without feeling embarrassed. In the wider Missouri dioxin story, people have long pointed to early incidents at horse facilities as the first visible sign that something was wrong, because animals sometimes respond faster and more dramatically to exposure than people do. Even later magazine reporting about Times Beach described the way residents remembered those earlier stories, like birds dying in barns after spraying, the kind of detail that lodges in a person's mind because it is so sharply out of place. Now, we need to treat this carefully. Anecdotes are not proof, and one of the reasons Times Beach became so psychologically difficult is that residents were trapped between two forms of evidence: stories that felt horrifying and specific, and official processes that moved slowly and spoke in cautious language. That gap between lived fear and institutional pacing is where folklore grows. It is also where distrust grows. Because if your neighbor is telling you something happened to animals after an oil spray, and officials are telling you they are evaluating, the human mind fills the space in between with its own explanations. Sometimes those explanations are fair. Sometimes they are not. But they are almost always emotional. There's another reason warnings were hard to read, because the town already lived with hardship that had nothing to do with chemicals. It lived with floods. It lived with tight budgets. It lived with the normal wear and tear of a small place. So when something feels off, people can blame the usual suspects. A bad season, a damp basement, a sickness that could be anything, a rash that might be detergent, a headache that might be stress. And then there's the cruelest feature of invisible environmental risk. Uncertainty can become its own sickness. People start watching their bodies more closely. They start tracking symptoms in their minds. They start connecting dots that may or may not connect. And when the town's name begins to appear in news coverage, that attention pours gasoline on the psychological side of the fire. A university paper on early coverage of the Times Beach crisis points out that residents were alarmed when, after the flood, they learned of recommendations related to evacuation based on high levels found in soil sampling. But notice the order there. Flood first, then the jolt of information. In the human mind, those two events fuse: water, panic, danger, departure. And because the flood is physical and memorable, it becomes the emotional frame for the contamination story, even though the contamination pathway began years earlier. This is the strange timeline effect that makes Times Beach feel almost supernatural to people. A town can live with an invisible risk for years. Then one dramatic event arrives, and suddenly the invisible risk becomes a public fact. It can feel like the ground itself changed overnight, even if the residue has been there for a long time. So warnings existed, rumors existed, fear existed, but nothing moves a story from uneasy to irreversible like a test result, stamped with authority, arriving at the exact moment a community is already shaken. And that brings us to the moment the town becomes a case file: soil testing, numbers, and a flood that forces officials to think beyond a town boundary.
Chapter 6: Testing the Roadside. When investigators started sampling soil, Times Beach stopped being a place and started being a measurement. When a government agency tests the ground of your hometown, it changes the air before the results come back. People begin to watch the workers. They watch where the samples are taken. They watch how the workers handle the soil, what kind of protective gear they wear, and how carefully they label things. And then, inevitably, they interpret. If the worker wears gloves, someone whispers it must be bad. If the worker does not, someone says the town is being dramatic. This is where the story's dual intent design comes alive naturally, because two audiences respond to this chapter differently. The eerie audience feels dread and conspiracy. The history audience recognizes bureaucracy and risk management. The truth in Times Beach is that both feelings can exist at once. The EPA's own timeline and site materials show the federal involvement and the progression toward relocation and remedy. And when you read those materials, you see something else that tends to get flattened into a single phrase in popular retellings. Officials were not only thinking about contamination as a static problem, they were thinking about contamination in motion. Because Times Beach was not a mountaintop town, it sat along the Merrimack River, and the floodplain was not theoretical. So, when the flood came, the question changed. It was no longer only, is the soil contaminated? It became, What happens if contaminated soil is pushed, smeared, redistributed, carried downstream, or buried under debris in ways that make future exposure harder to control? In other words, the river turned uncertainty into urgency. And urgency is where decisions become permanent. A paper about early media coverage of Times Beach notes that residents were alarmed to learn after the flood that health agencies recommended evacuation based on high levels found in soil samples. That sequence matters for how the town experienced the event, because from the residents' perspective, it can feel like the government waited after disaster to speak. And from the government's perspective, it can feel like an evolving situation where the flood amplifies consequences. Those two perspectives do not reconcile easily. This is why Times Beach still creates arguments decades later. Now, we need to be careful with claims that sound too precise unless we anchor them. So here's what we can say with strong footing. 1. The EPA publicly announced in February 1983 a plan to buy out approximately 800 residential properties and 30 businesses using Superfund dollars. 2. EPA's Superfund site profile describes relocation actions carried out with FEMA involvement and outlines the long-term remedy, including excavation and thermal treatment of contaminated materials. That buyout announcement is the moment a place becomes uninhabitable, not just in rumor, but in national policy. And notice the psychological cruelty of that word, uninhabitable. It does not mean burned down. It does not mean physically destroyed. It means, in theory, you could still walk through your house and see your own furniture, but you are told you should not live there. And for many people, that feels like a stranger kind of loss than a fire, because the home still looks like a home. It is still standing. The street still exists. The porch still creaks the same way. But your relationship to the place has been severed by information you cannot see. Pause. Let that sit. There is another layer here, and it is one that older audiences often feel in their bones. When officials tell people to leave, they are not only leaving property, they are leaving proof of life. Photo albums, letters, old tools, the kind of objects that hold a person's story. In one local account, the last mayor of Times Beach described being told not to take anything, to leave everything behind. Even if some details vary by household, the emotional truth is consistent. Evacuation is not a move, it's a rupture. And when a rupture happens under the pressure of uncertainty, people carry the question with them for the rest of their lives. Was this necessary? Or did fear, amplified by water and headlines, push the system toward the most extreme option? That unresolved tension is not an accident in how this story survives. It's the oxygen. And in a moment, we'll get to the detail that changes everything, because the buyout is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the erasure.
Chapter 7. The results that turned dirt into evidence. The moment the lab numbers came back, the town stopped being a rumor and became a file. At first, the sampling feels like a formality. A few scoops of soil, a few labels, a few men in government vehicles driving slowly down roads that locals have driven 1,000 times. But the emotional shift happens later, when the results begin to circulate and ordinary dirt is treated like proof. This is where Times Beach becomes one of those American stories that older viewers recognize immediately, even if they've never heard the name, because it contains a familiar pattern. Someone says it's safe enough. Someone else says it isn't. And in between those statements is a family trying to decide whether to sleep in their own bed.
EPA's own background materials describe the contamination pathway and the eventual response, including the shift toward relocation and long-term cleanup. But in the town itself, the first impact is smaller and stranger. People start to look at the roadside differently. They look at the edges of their yards. They look at the dusty strip where children ride bikes and dogs wander and lawn chairs sit in summer. And they ask a surprisingly hard-to-answer cleanly. How much contact is too much contact? Because risk is not a single event. Risk is repetition. It's the child who plays in the same patch of dirt every day. It's the person who sweeps the porch. It's the wind that lifts fine dust on dry afternoons. And that's why soil contamination becomes so psychologically invasive. You can't see it, but you can't stop imagining it. The official story is careful, as it should be. It tends to speak in phrases like levels of concern, site assessment, remedy, long-term stabilization. But the human story never uses those words. The human story says, is our town poisoned? And then the second question follows right behind it. If it is, why are we still here? That why often begins where anger begins. Because when you live inside a developing public health situation, it never feels like one smooth process. It feels like a series of partial messages. A headline here, a radio bulletin there, a neighbor's cousin who heard something, a county official who won't say much, and then a sudden, sharp sentence that cuts through everything. Don't go back. When that sentence arrives, people rarely receive it as a recommendation. They receive it as a verdict. Now add the reality that Times Beach was already vulnerable, not just to chemicals, but to water. It sat on a floodplain near the Merrimack River, and in late 1982, when the Merrimack rose hard enough to change the entire mood of the region, the story didn't just escalate, it reframed itself. Because a contaminated town on dry ground is one kind of problem. A contaminated town under floodwater is another. Chapter 8. The Flood That Changed the Conversation. Rehook. The flood did something the contamination could not. It made the danger feel mobile. Floods have a particular sound, a slow pressure, a distant roar, a constant movement that never lets the mind fully rest. And the Merrimack flood of late 1982 didn't only damage property, it triggered a new kind of fear in Times Beach. Not just what's in the soil, but where will it go? EPA's retrospective Looking Back page places the Times Beach story inside that flood context, and it also points to later testing done at Route 66 State Park, where EPA says sampling confirmed no significant health risk for typical park visitors and workers. That line, no significant health risk, is something you say decades later when the story has already had an ending. In the moment, during the flood, the town did not have the comfort of closure. It had only the nightmare logic of water. Water rises, water spreads, water leaves behind a residue. Even if you know nothing about chemistry, you know what water does. It touches everything. It carries what it touches. It deposits what it carries. So if contamination exists in patches, a flood threatens to turn patches into a smear. It threatens to move the problem beyond property lines, beyond the town boundary, beyond the places you can control with fences and signs. And that's a key psychological pivot in Times Beach. The contamination story might have stayed local for longer. It might have become one of those slow-moving environmental arguments that takes years to resolve. But the flood didn't allow for slow. It created urgency. One academic paper on early news coverage described how residents were alarmed after the flood when they learned of health recommendations based on high levels found in soil samples. That sentence contains the whole emotional architecture of the crisis. The flood comes first, the recommendation comes second, and the town experiences them both as one combined blow. There's also a practical side that older viewers tend to understand instinctively. When a community is flooded, it's already disoriented. People are staying with family, they're dealing with insurance and repairs and loss, they're arguing with contractors, they're exhausted. That is the worst possible moment to ask them to process technical risk. So in Times Beach, uncertainty and exhaustion collide. And when those collide, communities do not become more rational, they become more fragile. This is how a place can begin to fracture even before anyone officially leaves. Some residents will say it's being exaggerated. Some will say they're not telling us enough. Some will say we can't afford to ignore this. And in that mix, you get the final ingredient that makes Times Beach feel like a modern myth. A government that decides it cannot manage the risk in place. Not forever. Not with a river that returns. Not with fear that multiplies. So the next step is not a partial cleanup. It's a recommendation that sounds like something you say to a building that's on fire. Not a town.
Chapter 9. The recommendation, don't go back. There are different kinds of endings, and this one arrived while the houses were still standing. It's hard to describe what permanent relocation feels like until you picture it. It is winter. The air is thin. The streets are quiet, not because the town is dead, but because it's waiting. And then the message arrives. This place is not meant to be lived in anymore. EPA's archived press release from early 1983 includes a stark line. In response to CDC advice, EPA and FEMA determined that permanent relocation was necessary, with EPA transferring $31.1 million in Superfund monies to FEMA to accomplish it. That is government language for an extraordinary act. It's not a cleanup contract. It's not a warning label. It is the state deciding a community will be moved. And once a decision like that becomes public, the emotional logic changes again. People begin to think in irreversible terms. Should we take photos of the house now before anything happens? Should we start packing even before we know the details? If we leave, will we ever be allowed to return? If we stay, will we regret it? The press release language is official, but the experience is personal. Because every relocation, no matter how structured, has to pass through individual homes, through kitchen tables, through family arguments, through the oldest residents who have lived there long enough that the town is not a place to them, it's a timeline. And here, the story becomes strange again, because Times Beach wasn't a famous historic town. It wasn't a cathedral city. It wasn't even a place most Americans could find on a map. It was modest. It was practical. It was the kind of place that felt safe precisely because it wasn't important. And that is why its erasure hits a nerve.
The moral shock is not only dioxin. The moral shock is, if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. EPA's Superfund site profile says EPA provided $30 million to FEMA to relocate residents and acquire properties, with FEMA finishing those actions in 1986. And that timeline matters because it shows this was not a weekend decision. It unfolded as a process, a slow unmaking of a town. But to the people inside it, it can still feel sudden, because the moment the recommendation becomes public, the identity of the town changes overnight. It becomes the dioxin town. It becomes the evacuated town. It becomes the place you can't go back. And once a place has that reputation, it becomes nearly impossible to sustain ordinary life inside it. Schools empty. Small businesses lose customers. People stop investing in repairs. Even the people who don't believe the danger is real begin to feel the practical consequences of the story. This is where the town the government erased framing becomes fair without turning it into a conspiracy. Because when the federal government decides to purchase and relocate an entire community, the effect is the same whether you think it was necessary or not. The town becomes a ghost while it still has living residents. Now, here's the detail that changes everything, and it's the hinge for Part 4. The buyout wasn't just about Times Beach. It became part of a wider Missouri dioxin response, including incineration and disposal strategies that pulled material from multiple contaminated sites. This is how the story moves from relocation to cleanup, from homes to tonnage. And that shift is where many viewers decide what they believe. Was it rescue? Or was it overreach? Or was it the only option left after floodwater and uncertainty made the problem feel uncontrollable? Chapter 10. The Offer. Buy the entire town. A buyout sounds tidy on paper, but in real life, it turns grief into a process. At first glance, a government buyout looks like a clean solution. A set of forms, a set of appraisals, a set of checks. And in a purely administrative sense, that is what it becomes. A relocation program funded through federal money, coordinated through FEMA, backed by EPA decisions, and framed as the fastest way to reduce exposure. But a town is not an inventory. A town is a web of unrecorded things. Who watches whose kids? Which neighbor has the ladder? Which porch light means someone is awake and safe? The hardware store that lets you pay next week. The church basement that smells like coffee and old carpet. When a buyout begins, it doesn't only remove people from a place, it severs those webs. And the severing happens slowly enough that you can feel it. First, a handful of homes become empty, then a street, then a cluster. Then you realize the sound has changed. In a living town, even a quiet one, there are small noises: doors, trucks, radios, dogs. You don't always notice them until they begin to disappear. Times Beach entered that strange in-between phase, where the town still existed physically, but it was already being unmade. EPA's early 1983 announcement outlined the plan: buy out about 800 residential properties and 30 businesses. That's a line with weight, because it doesn't say, help residents relocate. It says, in effect, we will purchase the town. And once you purchase something, you can dismantle it. That is how erasure begins. Now, different residents will have experienced the buyout differently. Some would have felt relief, finally a decision, finally a way out of the uncertainty. Others would have felt insult, as if their lives were being priced and moved like furniture, and some would have felt both at the same time. This is the psychological complexity older audiences tend to appreciate because it mirrors how life actually is. People rarely experience big events with one clean emotion. They experience them as layers: relief, anger, shame, exhaustion, doubt, a strange numb gratitude. There is also a quieter layer: control. A buyout is a moment you realize you do not control the future of the place you live, even if you own the deed. Your home is still yours, but the social and financial meaning of it is being rewritten in public. Once the world decides your town is unsafe, the market collapses regardless of what you personally believe. So the buyout can become the only real option, even for people who disagree with the decision. And that dynamic, where people comply not because they agree, but because they are cornered, is one of the reasons Times Beach still produces arguments. Because decades later, if someone says, "We left because we had to," another person can say, "We didn't have to," and both can be telling the truth as they experienced it. Now there is a myth layer that often emerges at this point. The folklore version of Times Beach sometimes sounds like an instant evacuation, like helicopters, sirens, dramatic removal. But the more haunting reality is quieter. It is a town being emptied one signature at a time, one closing sale at a time, one goodbye at a time. And that quietness is precisely what makes it feel eerie in hindsight.
Chapter 11. What a home is worth when it's unsafe. The hardest part wasn't leaving a building, it was leaving the proof that your life happened there. There is a particular kind of grief that comes when you are told to leave something that still looks intact. Fire can make loss obvious. A tornado can make loss unquestionable. But a contamination fear can make loss feel like an argument you can't finish. Because you can stand in your own kitchen and think, "This looks fine. The cabinet's still shut. The floor still holds your weight. The light still turns on. And yet, the future has been revoked." This is where Times Beach becomes emotionally unique compared to other ghost town stories. In many abandoned places, the abandonment is gradual and economic. Jobs leave, people drift away, the town fades. In Times Beach, the abandonment is forced by a decision that arrives from outside, backed by labs and agencies, and amplified by the floodplain reality. So leaving isn't just moving, it's accepting a narrative about your own home that you may not fully agree with. EPA's record shows the relocation process in clear terms. EPA provided funds to FEMA for relocation and property acquisition, completed by 1986. But when you translate that into human time, it becomes months of limbo, weeks of packing, days of decisions, hours of leaving. And in the leaving, there are thousands of small choices that never appear in official summaries. Do you take the old dresser your father built, even if it's dusty and heavy? Do you take the carpet knowing it's been on the floor for years? Do you take the children's toys that have been in the yard? Do you wash everything? Can you wash everything? This is where the older audience feels the story in their hands, because they understand objects. They understand the way a home is built out of things that are not valuable to anyone else. A coffee mug from a long-closed diner, a letter in a drawer, a cracked photograph frame. And when you are told to leave, you either carry these things with you or you abandon them. And abandonment of personal objects is not just practical, it is symbolic. It is a kind of erasure. One local account from the last mayor of Times Beach described being instructed not to take anything, to leave it all behind.
Whether that instruction applied universally or varied by household, it captures the emotional idea that stuck, the sense that residents were leaving more than a town, they were leaving the evidence of their lives. This is also where resentment can harden, because if you believe the evacuation was necessary, you might still feel anger at how it was handled. And if you believe it was an overreaction, you might carry anger for the rest of your life because you feel something was taken that cannot be returned. This dual reading is exactly why Times Beach works for your channel. It has the eerie surface, a town erased, and it has the grounded depth, a policy decision made under uncertainty, shaped by flood risk and a contamination pathway that was bigger than any one town. And then there's the third layer, the one we haven't fully entered yet. What happens after a town is purchased? What happens to the buildings, to the streets, to the contamination, to the name? That is where the word disincorporation becomes more than a legal term. It becomes a burial. Chapter 12. A town erased on paper. The moment a town is disincorporated, it stops being a place in the eyes of the state, even if the land still sits in the sun. There is a difference between a town that empties and a town that ends. In the American imagination, ghost towns are often romanticized, old storefronts, silent streets, a story you can visit. Times Beach moved toward a different kind of ending, a legal ending, a name being removed from the list, a town being unmade not only in practice, but in definition. EPA's material describes the trajectory toward remediation and reuse and the broader Missouri dioxin response. As relocation progressed and the town emptied, eventually Times Beach was disincorporated. And that is a chilling word when you sit with it. Disincorporated. It means the community no longer exists as a municipal entity. No mayor, no council, no local government. It's not only that people left, it's that the town's legal personhood was withdrawn. The map can still show a location, but legally, the town becomes something else, a site, a parcel, a cleanup zone. Later, the land would become Route 66 State Park, and visitors would drive through without necessarily knowing what once stood there. And here, the story performs one of its most unsettling tricks. It replaces a community with the public space, which can be good and can be respectful, and can also feel eerie, because parks are places where people rest, and this park rests on a story of displacement and uncertainty. Now, if you want the myth layer to stay alive without becoming sensational, this is the moment you do it gently. People will say, even now, that you can feel something there. Not in a paranormal sense necessarily, in a memory sense, in a this ground holds an argument sense. Because the disincorporation didn't answer the central question. It closed the file. It ended the town. But it did not fully settle what people believe about why it happened. And that unresolved question is what keeps Times Beach from being just a historical footnote. It keeps it alive in the way a quiet documentary needs. It becomes a story not only about contamination, but about trust. Not only about a floodplain, but decision-making under fear. And the next part is where the story gets even more concrete. Because after the people are gone, the cleanup begins. And cleanup doesn't speak in emotions. It speaks in tonnage, in excavation, in ash. And that's where we will go next. Chapter 13. Burning the Problem. Once the people were gone, the story changed shape from homes and grief to machinery, heat, and ash. A town can be emptied with signatures, but contamination is not moved with paperwork. It sits in the soil. It clings to dust. It mixes into the layers that make up a place. So when Times Beach was no longer a community in practice, it became something else in the language of government, a remediation site. That shift matters for the tone of your documentary, because it's where the story becomes almost mechanical, and in that mechanical quality, the eeriness returns. The houses may still stand for a time, but the living part is gone, and what remains is a set of decisions about material. How much soil must be removed, where it goes, how it's destroyed, how you prove it's safe afterward. EPA's Superfund site profile describes the remedy in blunt industrial terms. Contaminated soils and materials were excavated, and the final remedy included thermal treatment of contaminated materials. Thermal treatment is one of those phrases that can sound sterile, but the reality is vivid. It means heat, high temperatures, the deliberate destruction of hazardous compounds by burning them out of existence. For a viewer, especially an older viewer, this is where you can lean into background cinema. We don't have to sensationalize it. The visuals are already heavy. Trucks rolling slowly in winter light, excavators peeling back layers of earth like old paint, piles of soil that look ordinary except they are treated like evidence, the controlled violence of industrial heat. And beneath all of this is a moral question that never fully goes away. If the land can be cleaned, why could the town not remain? Some people will answer that question immediately, because relocation reduced exposure quickly and the floodplain made ongoing control uncertain. Others will answer differently, because the decision felt bigger than the evidence required. And some will answer with an even quieter reminder. Because once a town is labeled unsafe, it becomes nearly impossible to restore the social and economic fabric that made it a town. But the cleanup phase also adds a deeper layer to the story, because Times Beach wasn't handled entirely in isolation. It was tied into a broader Missouri dioxin response, multiple locations, multiple contaminated areas. EPA's retrospective about the Missouri dioxin sites describes the contaminated waste oil being used at many locations, including Times Beach. So, Times Beach becomes part of a wider state narrative, not the only story, but the most famous one, because it was a town, a whole town. That distinction is why the name survives. Now here's where the documentary needs to stay honest. Some people will want us to say this was obviously right, obviously wrong, obviously corrupt, obviously necessary. But the most truthful version is the one that allows the tension to stay alive. Because this is what a viewer feels when they watch trucks haul away the physical remnants of a place. It looks like action. It looks decisive. But it also looks like the destruction of a community's footprint. It is both remedy and erasure. And the most haunting part is that it happens after the living have already left, as if the land is being reset and the town's history is being cleared like a chalkboard.
Chapter 14. The Park over the Ashes. When a site becomes a park, the story doesn't end. It just becomes easier to forget. If you drive through Route 66 State Park today, the landscape can feel ordinary. Trees, trails, quiet stretches of land where the mind relaxes. EPA's Looking Back page notes that the Times Beach area later became Route 66 State Park, and it also states that sampling in 2012 confirmed no significant health risk for typical park visitors and workers.
That sentence is meant to reassure, and it probably should reassure for typical use. But emotionally, it does something else too. It marks the transition from crisis to memory. And memory is a strange kind of second erasure, because a park is designed for leisure, not remembrance. People do not arrive at a park expecting a moral argument. They arrive expecting a Sunday afternoon. They arrive with children and dogs and snacks. And that's where the Times Beach story can feel uncanny. Because a place where people once lived, argued, married, and grew old has been turned into a place where strangers stroll and never have to know what stood there. This is not unique to Times Beach, by the way. History is full of places built over places. But what makes Times Beach different is how fast the transformation occurred, how modern it is, how documented it is, how many living people still remember it personally. So, for your channel, this chapter works because it creates an image that stays in the viewer's mind. A public place built over a story of relocation. A quiet trail where houses used to be. A picnic table where someone's kitchen once stood. The park doesn't have to be haunted to feel strange. It only has to be layered. And if you want the lean-back audience to stay through the later portion of the video, this is where you slow down. You describe the textures. Winter grass, rusting remnants near old road traces, the soft sound of wind through trees, the river still doing what it always did. Because the river is the constant character. It's the original warning, the floodplain the town was built on, the physical reality that shaped every decision. And in a quiet documentary, the river can become the voice that never comments, but always influences. Now, the story could end here with the site was cleaned, a park exists, life goes on. But Times Beach refuses to end neatly, because years later, people questioned the decision, not just in whispers, in public statements. And that keeps the argument alive and the comments active without you ever needing to become loud. Chapter 15. The Argument That Never Fully Ended. Some stories end when the problem is fixed. This one kept going because people disagreed about what fixed even meant. Times Beach is remembered as the town that was erased. But the deeper reason it stays alive is because it became a symbol. A symbol of environmental risk. A symbol of government intervention. A symbol of fear and uncertainty. And symbols tend to attract arguments. EPA's materials show the path toward relocation and remediation, but the public story grew larger than the official file. What does it mean when a whole community is relocated? One person will say, it means the government protected people from a hazard they could not see, and the floodplain raised the stakes. Another will say, it means the government overreacted, and a town paid the price. Both statements can feel true to the people who lived them. And this is where your dual intent design pays off. The eerie audience hears town erased and thinks curse, conspiracy, dread. The history audience hears policy under uncertainty and thinks risk, governance, trade-offs. A quiet documentary does not force a verdict. It holds both sides gently. It acknowledges what we know. It marks what we don't. And it asks the viewer to decide what they believe. Because that's what keeps them watching. Not because we want to manipulate them, but because the real story genuinely contains unresolved tension. Times Beach is at its core a question about what we do when we have incomplete certainty and high potential consequences.
And that is a question that never goes out of date. It's the kind of question older viewers often enjoy sitting with because they've lived long enough to see how often certainty is a luxury, and how often decisions are made in the fog. So, if we end this story properly, we don't end with a sensational line. We end with quiet respect for what it cost, and a final image that lingers.
Today, the river still moves past the place where Times Beach once stood. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't apologize. It doesn't explain. It just continues, as rivers do. And that might be the most unsettling part of all. Because for the people who lived there, the town was not a symbol. It was where they cooked dinner, where they fought and made up, where they celebrated birthdays, where they shoveled snow from small porches and waved to neighbors, and tried, in their own modest way, to build a life. Then came the tests. Then came the flood. Then came the recommendation that changed everything. And the town became a story the nation could argue about. A town erased not by fire or war, but by a decision made in the space between evidence and fear. Was Times Beach a necessary rescue from a genuine hazard, or a permanent relocation driven by uncertainty, flood risk, and the momentum of public alarm? We can hold both possibilities in the same hand because the people who lived it often did. And if you ever walk through Route 66 State Park and the wind is low and the river is quiet, it might occur to you that the past doesn't always disappear. It simply becomes invisible.